All right, so like you said, tonight I'm going to talk about React and Redux. I know that that is a little bit of heresy. I understand that. I know this is an Ember ATX meetup, but I actually strongly believe that as JavaScript engineers, even Ember enthusiasts, it's important that we build apps and frameworks in frameworks and libraries other than Ember. And so tonight I'm going to talk about the advantages of building apps in other frameworks. I'm going to talk about why I chose React and Redux for my latest project at work. We're going to do a high-level overview of the framework, and then I'm going to talk about what I learned by building an app in React. So before we get started about that, let me tell you a little bit more about me. If you don't know, my name is Michael Swanson, and I'm a huge Star Wars nerd. This is actually a picture of me and my wife at my birthday party this last year. She's not a Star Wars nerd or fan at all, but she let me have a Star Wars costume party for my birthday, which was kind of epic. I also work as an interaction designer and front-end engineer at Skills Engine. So let's get into this. So why build an app in a framework other than Ember? What's the point? Well, the truth is, a lot of times when we want to go learn a new framework, we go build a to-do app or we go do a proof of concept, right? And the problem with those is they really don't let us see all the ins and outs of a framework. They really don't show us all the rough edges, and we don't really get to know that framework. We just kind of do the most simple tutorial or whatever. And so that's the problem, right? But why should we care? Ember's awesome. Why do we care if we don't know any other framework? Well, when we build applications in other frameworks, there's a couple of things that I think are really true that really help us. The first is that we become better engineers and we become more employable, right? So I can go in an interview and I can say I develop web applications in JavaScript. I don't develop them in Ember. I don't develop them in React. I build JavaScript web applications. And that's an important distinction, right? And the other thing is that we learn different approaches. Ember has some pretty opinionated ways that it likes to build things. React also has some kind of opinionated ways that it wants you to build components and applications. And so learning those different ways makes me a better engineer, makes me think differently about how to solve problems on the web. Because of that, every application I build actually becomes better, right? I can make more informed decisions. I now know what the trade-offs are with React versus Ember. And as I build with different frameworks, I'm able to make better decisions about what makes the most sense for a project that I'm working on. The other thing is that as I'm learning these new frameworks, I'm learning new ways to solve these problems. I can actually port those things back into Ember and use those ideas and those solutions in my Ember applications. And that leads to the third point, which is Ember becomes better, right? As a community, when we learn new things from different frameworks, we can incorporate those things back into Ember. Data down, actions up is a great example, right? React did it first, and then we all saw how awesome it was, and now Ember does it as well. So why did I choose React and Redux for the project at work? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first was that my team at work at Skills Engine is almost exclusive React or Ruby and Rails developers. I was literally the only front-end guy and the only guy with Ember experience for a long time until just recently. So because that's true, we're building Ruby apps, right? We're building server-rendered pages, and we need to sprinkle on some really nice, highly interactive components, right? We could have gone the Ember Islands route, but Islands is not really a happy path for Ember, right? Ember really wants to kind of control the whole UI. Glimmer is going to be great. I've played with Glimmer. I can't wait to do more with Glimmer, but it's not quite production ready yet. So the other reason is React's cool, right? It's one of the cool kids. The companies out there are hiring for it. Like you said earlier, developers are talking about it. A lot of the guys in my office were excited that we were going to use React. They wanted to learn it. And then there's a little bit of FOMO going on here, right? Maybe React solves some problems that Ember has. I'm tired of hearing about it and not knowing about it, so I'm going to go see what everybody's talking about. And according to Twitter, it's simple, fast, small, and super awesome and better than everything else out there, right? There's actually a really great article. You can't really see it on here, but in the slide deck, this if you choose your JavaScript framework the way you chose your music, it's a great article about picking the right framework. And this section, what should I look for, has some really great questions to think about and think through as you're thinking about building a project in React or in Ember or whatever. So let's do an overview. Hopefully this will be pretty high level. If you have does anybody have experience with React at all? A little bit? Yeah? Okay, cool. So this will cover really kind of some high-level stuff, and there may be some things that are wrong in here. I don't pretend to know everything about them. This is just based on my experience and my understanding of these tools. So let's start with React. So React is a component library. That's it. That's all it does is components. Doesn't do anything else fancy. React components are isolated. They're declarative functions that take data in via props. They render DOM elements. They react to user interactions. That's all they do. So if you look at this, let me see if I got my mouse here. If you look at this class here, this is an entire React app that's one component, right? It does some constructor stuff to get the props. It binds a few methods so that you can call them, and then it creates some local state, right? Then it returns some HTML. It renders some elements. It renders a form to list the to-dos. And then down here, it handles changes to the UI, right? It handles a submit. It handles a change. So React components are, they're isolated. They don't manage state or data outside of their local context. This has no idea about anything around it. It just knows its own state. These components don't have any built-in way to interact with anything else, right? They can't call your backend API. They have webhooks. You could maybe use the fetch web API or something else to make API calls, but at the end of the day, this thing doesn't have any way to talk to your backend or really anything else. So basically, React components by themselves are pretty limited, and that's kind of by design, right? They follow this Unix philosophy of do one thing and do it well, and these components they're good components, but they don't do much. And so if you want to do anything really complex with a React component, usually you need to pair it with some other libraries or some web APIs to get it kind of outside of just itself. And that's where Redux comes in. So Redux provides a global client-side state store and a simple API to interact with it. So the Redux store is just a giant POJO. It's a big plain old JavaScript object. It contains all your application state and everything you need to be able to interact across components with your client-side logic. So Redux uses this dispatch method to send actions, which are themselves just really simple objects, to the listener functions called reducers. So you see here we have a dispatch call that sends this action with a type and a title, and it goes to a reducer. And the reducer is a pure function. It takes in the action, the current state, and then it calculates and returns a new state. So here you see we have the state and the action. We do a switch based on the action type, and then we destructure the current state, and we add a new to-do to that state, and that returns the store that, I don't know if you can see it over there, but the store basically has a list of all the old to-dos, and then it has our new to-do down here. So that's Redux. And really, Redux isn't tightly coupled to any view framework, including React, right? You can use it with most client-side frameworks. You can use it with vanilla JavaScript. We use REACT-REDUX, which is the kind of blessed package to connect it to React. But there's also, Torrin Billups has this amazing EMBER Redux, which lets you replace EMBER data with Redux if you like the style of Redux better. So I would encourage you to check that out if you're interested. So let's talk a little bit about the REACT-REDUX package. This is the package that creates bindings between React components and the Redux store so that you can actually make calls to the Redux store. So this is the connect method down here, kind of at the bottom. We pass in a map states to prop function, and we pass in the component. And this looks a little weird for us who are used to EMBER. But basically what this does is it returns a version of this component that is connected now to the Redux store and aware of the Redux store. So the dispatch or the connect method also gives us the dispatch method up here in the onComplete. We can now dispatch actions from this component to the Redux reducers. So we can update we can pass things to the state to be updated. And then the map state to props function down here that we pass into the connect component, it goes and it maps different pieces of the Redux store to props in the component. So here I'm mapping the state to-dos, the to-dos that are in the Redux store, to a to-dos property on our component. And so I have this .props.todos. I can map through those, and I can render to-do components for each one of my to-dos that's in the state store. So now we have a view layer that can interact with the data store. Yeah, not really a complete solution yet, but we're getting close, right? So there's a couple of things we still need. For real production applications, we first need to figure out how do we make API requests, right? So we can do that, like I said, with a lifecycle hook in the component where we can actually call the fetch API or some other async library, promise library, or whatever. Redux offers this plugin. And there's actually tons and tons of ways to do this. This is my favorite. Redux Saga manages your API requests for you. It will use concurrency. So I don't know if anybody's used EMBER concurrency, but this kind of has a similar process where you create these tasks and you can set those tasks to be async, and they're kind of side effect aware, so they go do their thing, and when they're done, they come back, they're cancelable, things like that. So it manages concurrency, it manages all your error handling, and then it actually gives you a way to dispatch actions to the reducer. So if you think about the process being that instead of sending an action directly to a reducer, I can now send it to Redux. Redux goes and makes an API request. When it gets done handling that API request, it makes another action call to the reducer with the updated data from my API call. So very, very clean way to handle this, very kind of separated concern for handling side effects in your app. The next thing we got to figure out is we got to figure out how to manage relational data in our store. If our store is a giant JavaScript object, we either have to start writing hard coding IDs across the board, or we have to figure out a better way to manage relational data in the store. So what happens when to-dos all of a sudden need assignees? Now we have users have to-dos. We have to figure out that problem. So the way that we handled it in our app at work is we use this plugin called Redux ORM. And Redux ORM works on top of the Redux store, and it provides this API for managing relational data in Redux. So think about in Ember data, you have models, and the models have belongs to and has many. This is pretty much what the Redux ORM gives us. We have a model now. That model can have relationships in it, and in my reducers, I manage those entities with the Redux ORM API. So.
Does it have async capabilities? How does that work?
The async capability all happens in Redux Saga. So the models themselves don't actually have they don't get changed or updated until all the async work is done. So everything that is side effect heavy, or everything that happens out of band in terms of your kind of application flow, happens in Redux Saga, and it waits to update the models until the API calls are done.
Okay.
So there's a very clear separation of concerns, and like the way that Redux thinks about it is, I only want to change things that I know the state of. Like if there's any side effects, any like non-functional like step through kind of things, those things happen in a side effect somewhere else. I don't know about them. I don't care about them. All I care about is you sent me an action. This is the change to the data. I'm going to update the store. So by the time Redux ORM sees it, it's already been done. All that stuff's been finished. So what about routing and URL changes? What happens when I need to go from a list view to an item view? Well, there are a bunch of different router implementations in React. The one that I have used is the React router, and it's a component-based router. Basically, you wrap each one of your sections of your app in a component. That component has a pattern match to match the URL of whatever the state is for the URL, and then it renders those components based on that.
So what's the difference between like handling the routes like on the server side versus like handling the routes on the front end side?
So when Ember is in control of all of this state, the URL gets read by the Ember router, and the Ember router decides which view to render. In React, there are a couple of places in our app where we have a component that needs to be aware of what the URL says and aware of like some information in the URL so that we can read that and we can do something with it. And so React router lets us decide based on the pattern that's in the URL which components we need to render.
Yeah, because I think you can do routes on the Redux side as well, if I remember correctly. Do you have any experience on it?
Which is it?
You can do routes on the Redux. Like
Yeah, so there's another plugin that I haven't used called Redux React Router that uses Redux to manage the routes. And so there's many, many different implementations of how this works. So this is just one of them that we used. The next piece you got to think about is computed state, right? What happens when I want to see all the completed to-dos? And so in Ember, we have computed properties. In Redux and React, they use this awesome plugin called Reselect. The coolest thing about this is that it memoizes the functions. So since the functions are pure functions, I can memoize those things, and they don't ever cost me anything again. They're just immediate until I change one of the dependent keys, and then all of a sudden it re-renders or recalculates that state for me. They're also really great for when I'm pulling things out of the state store. So if I pull out, say, one to-do, as long as that to-do doesn't change, every time I call that memo-wise function, that reselect function, it just pulls me back a cached version instead of going back to the state store, which is really great.
How's it compare to Ember.computed?
I don't actually know if Ember.computed memoizes the actual function that you pass to it.
It memoizes the value.
Yeah. So I guess it's very similar then.
Okay.
So it does a lot of the same stuff. And then testing integration. Apparently you're supposed to write tests for your code. React and Redux use Enzyme and Jest for unit test and integration tests. If you have any experience, you've probably written some stuff in there. And then the last part is build pipeline, right? We gotta ship some production code. So for React, they love Webpack. They're all about Webpack. Everywhere you read, you're supposed to use Webpack with your React components. So.
The Jest, what was before Jest? Because I'm sure that's really, I think that's new, right?
So before they used Jest, I'm not really sure. So Jest is the way you write them. I think the actual, you can use it with different, and maybe it's Enzyme that you can use with different test runners. So you can use, and I can't even remember now.
Is Enzyme the thing that'll like render the components, like you like click the buttons and shit?
So both of these will, both of these kind of will let you do both, but they have a little bit different. Enzyme is better for integration type testing, because it'll render multiple components and child components. Jest, they really they single in on, you render this component and you see what it looks like, and you introspect it, and you just unit test that one component.
Curiosity, like, on all the tools.
Right.
A lot of tools.
There's a lot of tools.
Like how much choosing did you have to make on each of those 5 things?
A lot.
Okay.
So we'll get to that in a minute.
There's a fuckload of different options for every one of them.
There are literally, if you go to NPM and you do a search for React router or React API, there are, like if you do that in Google, you're going to get thousands of results and you'll get lots and lots of plugins. This is a very big ecosystem with a lot of people trying to solve the same problems and solving them in slightly different ways. And so we'll get to that in a minute. So like you said, this is a lot of stuff, right? So maybe mapping it to Ember concepts will be helpful. All right, so let's try and map these things to Ember. Maybe that'll help us fit them together. So the first thing to look at is a React component. A React component, Ember component, largely the same things, right? They display and update the DOM. They handle user interactions. They send actions. They have lifecycle hooks. If you take Redux with its actions and reducers, you add sagas and ORM, you basically get Ember data with adapters and serializers. It's a pretty, not exactly, but pretty close. React router, Ember router, basically they handle it very differently, but they both try and manage your routes and your URL state.
What is HBS? What is not familiar?
So I'm sorry. So if you're not familiar with Ember components have 2 files. They have a JS file and a handlebars template file.
Oh, okay.
So in React, there is only one file, if you noticed, right? Like it puts the HTML and the JavaScript all kind of in one big file. So yeah, in the JSX files. So here you're talking about an Ember component, both parts, in order to kind of equal a React component. Then like we said, reselect gives us basically what the routes and the computer properties do in terms of retrieving the data and being able to compute the state. And then Jest, Enzyme, Webpack, that's basically Ember CLI, right? They're trying to do Ember CLI with a lot of that stuff. So hopefully that helps you kind of understand how these things would maybe map to each other. So this is what, let me talk a little bit about what I've learned. So part of the value of building a real app, like I said before, in another framework, is that you get a much more nuanced view of the shortcomings and the strengths of that framework, right? So it's true of React. It's true of my experience with that as well. So a couple of things I really, really liked about React was it's really easy to get started with, right? You saw that to-do app. It's one component, and you have this kind of functional little app, right? So that's pretty cool. It's really easy to integrate into server-rendered applications. So like I said, we have this Rails app. We installed React Rails as a gem, and that's it, right? Then we all of a sudden have this method in our Ruby views, render React component, and we pass it a component, and it renders that component, which is pretty cool. I think actually Redux data flow is extremely easy to reason about, and I actually prefer it over the way Ember Data does it, because it only lets you modify the state in one place, right? I know exactly where my state is being modified. I can go to that reducer file, I can see what's happening, and that's the only place it happens. There's a really nice separation of concerns there, and I think Ember Data could learn a lot, frankly, from the way that it works, because I have debugged many Ember apps where I'm trying to figure out what thing is changing the state of this object in the data store. And really, using this has really changed the way I think about building components. So React has a strong opinion that you should build single-purpose components, and then you should wrap those single-purpose components in higher-order components. And it really kind of emphasizes the separation of display concerns from data and application state concerns. And a lot of times, and for me at least, my Ember apps, my components tend to do both, right? They tend to modify some state. They know they have a service they connect to go do some things outside of themselves, right? They tend to get really bloated. React made me really think about this component knows about this, and it builds just this piece. And then it sends some actions, and it might get some new data, but at the end of the day, it's a single purpose component. And the higher order components above it go get its data and tell it kind of what to do. And so I really like this about React. I think this has really changed the way I will build Ember apps in the future. But React is not without its rough edges, right? So this is the big one for an Emberist, right? There's really very few conventions, no standard best practices. So it's kind of like Backbone circa 2012 when you build your own framework. You had to add all the parts and pieces. You got to build your pipeline. You're writing grunt plugins, except now it's Webpack, right?
Did you use Create React?
Yeah, so the problem, well, I get to that in my slides, but basically the problem with Create React app is that it works really well for an SPA. It sucks for like sprinkling on top of a Rails app.
Yeah, you cannot do server render.
Yeah.
You cannot do Redux.
Isn't there a new Rails thing for Webpack?
There is. It's coming out in version 5.1. They're going to use Webpack as a default instead of the asset pipeline, I think. So
It looks pretty mature by now, though.
Yeah.
I have no experience.
So one of the other things I ran into,
Rails Webpack?
the Rails Webpack gem, yeah. So that React Rails gem uses Webpacker, which is the Webpack Rails gem, to do all of its Webpack stuff. So it basically, the React Rails gem uses Webpack to build React with a Webpack Rails gem, if I said that right.
Twisted.
Yeah, no kidding. Another place that we struggled a lot with our app was testing in general, but then specifically in integration testing. The React community emphasizes unit tests, obviously, because they want single-purpose components. They want you to write a lot of unit tests around that, but they struggle with integration stuff. I've personally found very little helpful information on integration testing around the React sections. Like I want to integrate my reducer. I want to test my reducer with my action. I want to send that to my component. Like I want all those. I want to test that whole flow works, right, and does what I expect it to do. And it's a lot of build your own test harness stuff out there, and so that's a challenge. And then custom pipelines, right? Like these are painful to build sometimes. Webpack is hard, especially when you have to configure it. We have Babel, we have Webpack, we have ESLint, we have some Sass linting that we have for our style sheets. So building all that stuff together and then adding on the mystery of Rails asset pipeline, it's just kind of painful. So, and then to your point about Create React app, that was the first thing I looked at. I was like, oh, we should just use this, right? Because this Create React app, if you don't know, is basically, it kind of tries to solve a bunch of these problems. It has some standard conventions for how you do things. It helps you set up your test harness. It kind of configures Webpack to work mostly for you. And so it's great, but it's really for SPAs. And if I'm going to build an SPA, I'm probably going to build it in Ember. I like React, but Ember's better. So, just to reiterate, building production applications in frameworks and libraries other than Ember makes us better developers, makes our products better, and it makes Ember better. So go forth and build. Thanks.